In this presentation, I will apply utilitarianism theory in the support of waste reduction through sustainable practices as the most effective means to conserve resources, energy, and money. Are sustainable practices across the business sector and in our homes more resource and cost efficient than the reactive approach of applying damage control in the wake of crises? Climatologists backing the most recent climate change reports both nationally and globally, and proponents of organic farming would agree that prevention succeeds reaction. In fact, in 2008, the United Nations set the standard for environmentally ethical business by appointing a council to organize 6 principles for responsible investing. These principles dictate that environmental, social, and corporate governance issues are to be considered in responsible investing. Therefore, the governing body that assists in managing international relations from an unbiased stance, the UN, recognized the need for a preventative approach nearly a decade ago. I'll go more into fossil fuels later, but this is a perfect example of a non-replenishable resource in desperate need of replacement as an energy source. Another limited source, despite its common occurrence on the planet, is water. This is because clean water for drinking and other household needs is far less common than salt water, for example, which is not viable for drinking or many of the things that we use water for. This resource is limited even more by pollutants from commercial waste and leaching from traditional farming practices and landfills. Water can easily be conserved by turning off faucets at appropriate moments and recycling dishwater for use in the garden and taking shorter showers instead of bathing in a full tub. Even our replenishable resources like lumber and man-made substances like plastic can be stretched further than their current consumption through recycling. As a convenience-driven society, we require these materials. As the population grows, we face the problem of a shortage that would severely alter our current way of life. Water and air are the defining factors of life on this planet. Aside from extremophiles, there are few species that can exist without sufficient access to these things. When the quality of water and air suffer, so suffers the quality of life for all of us. Ingesting enough polluted waters can lead to mild illness, severe illness, and death, just as prolonged exposure to polluted air. As previously mentioned, unsafe practices in agriculture and irresponsible waste disposal in business are 2 of the major contributors to water pollution, but these also contribute heavily to air pollution as well. When determining responsible business practices in 2008, the UN estimated that the total damage globally as a result of human life was $6.6 trillion that year, with the projection of $28.6 trillion in annual damages by 2050. This projection was adjusted to 23% less in consideration of better technology, as well as improving safe practices in the public and private sectors. The projection of damages for 2008 was 11% of the gross domestic product. This means that more than 1/10 of the revenues generated internationally should have gone towards damages caused by poor business practices to sustain. Unfortunately, the more likely scenario is that we continue to accrue debt in the absence of sustainability that we will come up short for when investing in our future has become crucial. Biodiversity is what makes every type of environment unique. The more plentiful the life on our planet is, the healthier the environment remains as the food chains replenish the vitality of the planet. Biodiversity may not seem like the most important feature of the planet to preserve, but if you consider the uses for the documented organisms we have discovered in researching the natural world, it is perhaps exactly that. As species become endangered due to irresponsible waste disposal, leaching from landfills and traditional farming, and civil unrest in developing countries, our ability to research and fully understand the role of these species becomes hindered. Furthermore, It is important to the scientific community to document what we can on all life on our planet so that we can understand the process of evolution, if not for the benefit of planning for the future, then to acquire a greater understanding of our planet and of ourselves. The more resistant we are to holistic change in our approach to the environmental health, the more problems seem to arise. Particularly in the U.S., frivolous waste as well as frivolous use of resources has been a contributor in straining international relations since gas prices began skyrocketing over a decade ago. Current assessments of the environment warn that the way we're currently going about utilizing our resources is causing illness and death indiscriminately to those exposed to the pollutants. With the current state of healthcare in the U.S., we cannot afford to accept this kind of behavior. The largest populations in the nation are going to suffer the most due to the difficulty acquiring and maintaining healthcare. There have been countless documentaries chronicling the cruelty towards animals and unsanitary working conditions of factory farms in the last decade. Being at the top of the food chain does not give us the right to essentially torture other living creatures to feed ourselves. Factory farms are also owned by major corporations like Walmart and Purdue that often do not appropriately compensate or involve themselves in the health of their employees. Smaller farms run by families are easier to enforce organic and sustainable practices on. These establishments make for much safer and healthier working conditions and also contribute to local economies rather than funneling all agricultural revenues to major corporations where the wage gap between the laborer and corporate offices is stifling. Supporting small-scale farms supports a better quality of life for more people. The proposed budget of the EPA lingers at about $120 million annually, though what is actually collected and spent on labor materials and accommodations for remedial action has been between $6 and $8 billion annually for the last 20 years. The EPA is responsible for emergency response in the event that hazardous materials become an immediate threat to human life. Or the environment, respectively. There are also many programs for less urgent issues, such as oil spills, air pollutant releases, underground storage tanks, and cleanups for federal, private, nonprofit, and commercial sites that require evaluations to determine the relevance and amount of grant money through the agency for proposed remedial action. Billions of dollars being spent cleaning up messes from the environmentally irresponsible is better spent conserving wildlife or funding research for the development of new energy sources. This is a table from the book Public Policies for Environmental Protection, and it gives a good description of how waste is currently, was currently, this was the end of the 90s, how it was taken care of. It hasn't really changed much. The only thing that has changed, according to this book, is the amount of money that has been spent. Initially, whenever sustainable practices were introduced, the cost of safe removal went up. Since that time, incentives have been introduced to make these more cost efficient, but because it is an extremely cost intensive procedure going through and having wastes removed in solid, liquid, and gaseous forms that are not a hazard to the environment, it is essentially just easier to prevent waste. This is actually what I was discussing earlier, which is the discrepancy between the workforce and the enacted budget of the EPA. This was taken from their website in their About Us section, in the budget section of that. The last column, of course, is what has been applied towards the workforce. And if you notice, Between 1995 and 2015, the enacted budget hasn't really changed much. It's remained between $6 billion and $8 billion. And in case you're wondering, it is very difficult to find out exactly what they're doing with that money. But a lot of it is going to remediation. It is expensive in larger land, and especially whenever it's a more hazardous material and it is coming from a government or a government establishment or from a commercial establishment that is taken care of by the government. We've known for a long time that fossil fuels are a temporary solution to the energy problem. In the 1980s, campaigns for energy conservation were incorporated into children's shows and movies and commercials. Children's shows and movies I remember, like Captain Planet and Ferngully. Technology was still very limited at this time, and campaigns seemed to focus on guilt, deprivation, and small-scale change for the citizens of the U.S. It was not until the bailouts of the Great Recession that incentives were given to those capable of making change from the very top. Corporate bailouts for car companies from the president negotiated new models in coming years that were more energy efficient. Incentives were particularly helpful if these corporations agreed to integrate electric models in attempts to begin the phasing out of petroleum. Keep in mind that these incentives were negotiated through corporate bailouts in the last few years. This was an ingenious response to the energy crisis as it arrived. But the energy crisis was able to emerge and affect us all because foreign policymakers with corporate ties were not proactive, despite much controversy over the rising gas prices. This was taken from the Global Economic Symposium's website. This is a list of countries that essentially participate in the major oil industry, and this is comparing producers to consumers. If you notice, the U.S. is a major consumer, and they do not even cover half of their consumption in their own production. And this is a problem. For thousands of years, man has sought guidance from a higher power. The doctrines that were born in the spiritual pursuit all name man as the protector of his environment and the kingdom of animals. A beautiful home is something we can all take pride in, regardless of our social status. A healthy planet and a happy home is something we can all feel good about, and that is a credit to humanity in and of itself. Thank you very much.